Today, I'm so excited to share a few of my favorite sourdough recipes for fall. On the menu, we have sourdough apple cinnamon bread, hand-rolled sourdough pasta with pumpkin cream sauce, and a sourdough pumpkin cobbler. Let's start the day off with dessert before dinner with sourdough apple cinnamon bread, which is one of our family favorites. You can grab the full recipe for this over on my blog at moonandmagnolia.com, but first I am getting the apple mixture going, and that is 2 Granny Smith apples peeled and chopped, 1.5 tablespoons of lemon juice. You can use fresh lemon or bottled lemon juice, a 1/3 cup of brown sugar, and a teaspoon of ground cinnamon. You can use any apples you have for this, but Granny Smith or tart apples like that are really good for baking because they are tart, which counterbalances some of that sweetness. So if you have a tart apple or a sour apple, they are great for this recipe. And here I am just combining the lemon juice, the brown sugar, and cinnamon in a bowl and letting it sit for a while, really to get out some of the moisture from those apples, and it creates this really delicious caramel-like syrup that we will put into the bread soon. This is a quick bread recipe, so you don't have to worry about letting the dough ferment, and you definitely don't have to worry about doing stretch and folds because this is a bread batter, not a bread dough. So for the batter, it is 1/2 cup of butter, 2/3 cup of granulated sugar, 2 large eggs and 1 egg yolk, 1/4 cup of sourdough starter discard. It can be active or inactive, whatever you have on hand is fine. A cup of all-purpose flour, a teaspoon of baking powder, and 1/3 cup of orange juice. The extra egg yolk is actually optional. So what it does is it creates more richness in the bread, which of course is delicious. And that is a really good hack for cookies too. So as we're heading into holiday seasons, if you throw an extra egg yolk into your cookies, it makes them really good. And when you are making sourdough discard recipes, it is really helpful to put the discard into the eggs and mix those together and then pour that into the other ingredients because the eggs are an emulsifier, which helps stir in that starter. It can be a little hard to mix into the batter without doing that first. So I just creamed together the butter and the sugar and then added in the egg starter mixture, and then I just folded in the rest of the ingredients. And so here you can see these apples are nice and syrupy, so it's time to assemble the bread. So I am putting about half of the batter into a buttered loaf pan. And then I am spooning in about half of the apple mixture, including that delicious syrup, and I'm drizzling that around the edges. And then it is rinse and repeat. Put the remaining half of the batter on top of those apples and the remaining half of the apples on top of that batter. Don't worry if it seems like there's a lot of liquid pooling at the edges of your loaf pan. That turns into caramelized goodness, so just let it do its thing. And then I bake this in the oven at 350 for about an hour. Because there is that syrupy mixture in there, sometimes it takes a little bit longer than an hour, so just use a toothpick in the center, and if it comes out clean, it is ready. Now, we are like vultures with this bread. As soon as it comes out of the oven, everybody wants a slice, but I will say it is a lot easier to slice, and I think it tastes a little bit better if you let it at least cool close to room temperature. I think it's best if you let it come to room temperature and then refrigerate it and let it get nice and cold. It's so good like that. It's like a pound cake. And you can see here after baking, it is nice and caramelized and gooey on the bottom. It's a buttery pound cake in the middle with apples on top, and it is so good. You can grab this recipe over on my blog at moonandmagnolia.com. I will leave a link for that in the description box below. Next up is a sourdough dinner recipe. I know when we think about sourdough, often we think about baking, but there are a lot of great things you can make for dinner with sourdough, including sourdough pasta. And in this case, I am making it with fresh milled grains and mixing it with a homemade pumpkin cream sauce. This is a pretty classic egg pasta recipe, but with added sourdough discard. It is about 300 grams of flour, 3 eggs, about 40 grams of sourdough starter, and a little bit of olive oil as needed. I have tried making pasta dough in my food processor, stand mixer, and by hand, and I have found that the food processor when making a big batch is really the easiest way to go. And the one thing that's a little deceptive about pasta dough, especially if you are used to making bread dough, it is really stiff and dense. Once it comes out of the food processor, it's a little crumbly, almost like pie dough. So just form it into a shaggy ball, put a bowl over it, and let it sit for 30 minutes, and then knead it by hand for about 5-8 minutes or so until it is pliable. And then you can shape it into a disc, wrap it up tightly in saran wrap, and let it sit for about 2 hours. Now for shaping the pasta a few hours later, I am using a gnocchi board because I have found this to be the easiest way to make hand rolled pasta. So simply you just roll the dough into a rope, chop it into like 1/2-inch pillows, and then you slide it along the gnocchi board, and that pattern leaves not just a beautiful design, but it also holds more sauce. I will leave a link for that gnocchi board in the description box below. I have a full tutorial on my blog about how to use the gnocchi board, so I will link that in the description box below too, but I want to get into this pumpkin cream sauce. So I am simply chopping up about 1/2 an onion or so and sauteing it in butter. And then once the onion is just really lightly caramelized, I am adding in a little bit of fresh garlic that came out of our garden. And now I am putting in, I'd say about 2 tablespoons of flour, and let that cook for a minute, and then add in some milk, a cup of pumpkin. I'd say that was probably about 2 cups of milk. For sauces like this that are really forgiving, I don't usually measure very closely. But then I am adding in these beautiful fall flavors, some cinnamon, and just a pinch of nutmeg, salt and pepper. And while that thickens up, I am bringing the pasta to a boil. So the deal with cooking homemade pasta is it cooks really quickly. So get your sauce going, and when it's close to being done, then start your pasta. And now I am transferring the pasta into the sauce, and I don't even care if a little bit of that pasta water gets in there because it will help thicken it up. And I forgot some of the most critical ingredients until the last minute: Parmesan cheese and just a few tablespoons of cream cheese. And this was the most delicious, really almost like a mac and cheese like texture, but with the pumpkin-y fall flavor, and it was so good. And that pasta even had like a little pocket on the back that held a bunch of sauce, and we loved this. Last up on the fall sourdough menu is a sourdough pumpkin cobbler. Since there are just 3 of us in our household, I am making a half batch of this, but for a full batch, you would mix together 2 cups of all-purpose flour, a 1/2 cup of sourdough starter, active or inactive, either one, 1/3 of a cup of butter, a 1/4 cup of honey, 1 teaspoon of baking soda, a teaspoon of baking powder, a 1/4 teaspoon of cinnamon, about a 1/2 teaspoon of salt, 1/4 cup of cream, and a 1/4 cup of brown sugar. And over on my blog where this recipe is, you can get all of those measurements in grams too, if that is more your vibe. This is for the cobbler topping, and I should note I don't add the leavener, the baking soda, or the baking powder until a little bit later. So mix together all of the ingredients except those 2 things, and I'll show you how to add those in just a second. So now I am making the pumpkin filling, which is very similar to a pumpkin pie, and if you ask me, a little bit better because it isn't quite so thick and sweet. So for the pumpkin filling, it is 2 cups of pumpkin puree, 3 eggs, a 1/2 cup of brown sugar, a 1/2 cup of milk, 4 tablespoons of butter, 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract, 2 teaspoons of pumpkin spice or as much as you want, and about a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. Once that's all mixed together, I just pour it right into a well-seasoned cast iron pan and put it in the oven and bake it at 350. For a full batch, it's usually closer to 25 minutes. For this half batch, I think I did about 20 minutes, but what you're looking for is for it to be, I'd say, about halfway cooked. Usually mine's ready when it starts to crack a little bit in the middle, but you don't want to overcook it because you have to bake it one more time once you get the topping on. When the pumpkin filling is pretty close to being done, I then add the leaveners into the cobbler topping. Technically, you could add them in at any time into the topping dough, but I prefer waiting because once you get them in there, they start to activate. And I have found in the past when I put them in early, my cobbler topping gets a little too fluffy. So I prefer to wait until it's just about time to put it on the pumpkin pie filling. And now I don't like to roll out the dough and cut biscuits because I am always looking for the fastest way to get delicious food on the table. So I use this more like a crumble topping. I just put it right on top and bake it for about another 20 to 25 minutes until it is golden and delicious. This tastes very similar to a pumpkin pie, and it is much easier to make than a pumpkin pie. It is delicious with vanilla ice cream, and my favorite way to have it is with a cup of coffee in the morning for breakfast. You can grab this recipe over on my blog at moonandmagnolia.com. One of the easiest ways to keep track of all these recipes that I have on my blog and in this video is to save this video to your Pinterest board. You can do that by going right over to the video share button on YouTube, select Pinterest, and then you can choose the board you want to save it to. And last but not least, if you are feeling inspired to get into the kitchen for fall cooking and baking, don't forget to grab my free fall kitchen essentials checklist. It will keep you on track with everything you need for fall cooking and baking without even having to think about it. I will leave a link for that also in the description box. I hope you are having a wonderful fall. I hope you are feeling the fall spirits and you are ready to get into the kitchen for some delicious cooking and baking. Thanks so much for stopping by today, and I will see you again next time.